themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with remote committee proceedings of HRES 8, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum and will now recognize myself for opening remarks. First, I want to thank our witnesses and the members of the public for joining today's hearing on the importance of strengthening U.S. digital economic engagement with the Indo-Pacific region. The Indo-Pacific is home to many of our closest allies and significant trading partners, with more than 662 million people and a combined GDP of 3.2 trillion. I have long supported deepening economic relations with our Indo-Pacific partners, and I believe we can do that in a way that protects and benefits American workers and strengthens the U.S. economy. I also commend the Biden administration for its continued prioritization of the region and its efforts towards developing an Indo-Pacific economic framework. Today's hearing focuses on what I hope will be one important pillar in the broader economic framework, digital trade. The Indo-Pacific region contains the majority of the world's internet users and the fastest growing internet market. The pandemic has only further accelerated these trends. US companies and platforms remain dominant in this expanding but increasingly competitive market, and further US leadership is necessary to expand economic opportunities that improve the livelihoods of our workers and consumers in the United States and beyond. As chair of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific, I don't intend for this hearing to examine what should be encompassed in the digital trade agreement, but rather I hope our witnesses will help talk about the geopolitical, economic, and strategic importance for the United States to engage our Indo-Pacific allies and partners on the development of standards for the digital economy and technology. Countries in the region have long been negotiating and implementing digital trade policies to stimulate economic growth and improve the livelihoods of their citizens. Although these conversations occur thousands of miles away, they have significant implications for data protection and privacy, trade facilitation, and other issues that affect the American people and our economy. But despite the wide-reaching impact of these agreements in today's interconnected economy, the United States is not at the table to ensure that the standards and norms being established align with our shared democratic principles. Our absence risks allowing countries that do not share our pro-worker, pro-consumer, pro-small business, and pro-environmental values to advance digital governance standards antithetical to democratic practices. We need to engage our allies and partners to advance a prosperous Indo-Pacific region that supports a rules-based international trading system and high standards that prioritize openness and the free flow of data. The United States has experience negotiating digital trade chapters, which we did in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement and in a standalone US-Japan digital trade agreement. These agreements provide for non-discrimination, consumer protection, and privacy, and prohibit customs duties and technology transfer requirements, among other obligations. Working to lower barriers to digitally enabled trade and establishing rules that allow for non-discriminatory competition with Indo-Pacific countries will help US companies compete more effectively. I also want to be clear that this will need to be an inclusive process with the consultation of relevant stakeholders and groups. The NAFTA renegotiation process demonstrated what's possible when all parties are at the table, and there's open dialogue and compromises that ultimately strengthen the outcome that resulted in USMCA. I've had the opportunity to hear from experts with differing opinions prior to today's hearing, and I look forward to continuing to work and have this conversation with labor and environmental groups to ensure that the U.S. digital economic engagement with the Indo-Pacific continues to be pro-worker, pro-environment, and pro-small business. Our competitors are not waiting for us as they continue to shape the rules of the digital road in the Indo-Pacific. The United States has a unique window of opportunity to economically re-engage the region on this pivotal issue, and work with allies and partners to advance a free, open, and prosperous Indo-Pacific underpinned by our shared commitment to democratic norms and principles. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, as well as voices from other stakeholders and relevant industries to ensure that we demonstrate sustained global leadership on these important issues. Again, thank you to the witnesses and the members for participating today. I will now yield 5 minutes to my good friend from Ohio, our ranking member, Representative Steve Shabbat, for any opening comments you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank in advance the witnesses for sharing their insights with us here this morning. It's hard to overestimate, as you've indicated, the strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific. The region accounts for about a third of global economic activity, has huge growth potential. With over half of the world's population and a youthful population at that, the region is poised to become an engine of global economic growth over the coming decades. Moreover, the countries throughout the Indo-Pacific are hungry for trade with the US, with each other, and with the rest of the world. And the world is hungry for trade with them. A free and open Indo-Pacific is critical to the US's economic future, as many of our largest trading partners are in the region, and there's enormous potential to grow those ties. While the US has strengthened our trade pacts with South Korea and Japan and developed gold standard rules on digital trade through the USMCA, we cannot rest on our laurels. But that's exactly what we are doing as Beijing continues to pressure Indo-Pacific countries to trade their sovereignty for the Chinese Communist Party's so-called common destiny, while we fail to provide a clear option for these countries to turn to. Let me be blunt, Mr. Chairman, this administration has no meaningful agenda for economic statecraft in Asia right now. And I say that with great remorse, because we ought to be working together on this, and I know you and I are. This brings me to the topic of today's hearing, the digital economy, which is comprised of emerging tech like AI, advanced semiconductors, and 5G. It's critical to superpower status in geopolitical competition. And this 21st century economic engine runs on data, a resource with infinite supply. Sustained and enhanced U.S. leadership in digital trade and innovation benefits not only our economy and workforce, but our national security and economic well-being. That's why writing the rules around data and digital trade are so consequential. And fortunately, we have templates in the U.S.-Japan trade agreement and in USMCA that would provide an ideal starting point for a high-quality deal. That's why I was pleased to join you, Mr. Chairman, in leading a letter to USTR to ask that they move toward such a deal. From Zoom meetings to online shopping to the increasing use of big data and AI in manufacturing sectors, the digital economy will only grow in importance to U.S. economic success. All these factors make the timing so appealing for a digital trade agreement in the Indo-Pacific. The consequences of inaction on digital trade with the region could be dire, as data and the digital economy are a matter of the utmost importance to Xi Jinping. The CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, grasps the value of data and is using it to coerce and control its trade partners. Over many years, the CCP has passed laws, regulations, and standards that give it control over the data of its companies and citizens, while at the same time scouring the globe to funnel data back to China. While we think a lot about ports and national resources, unfortunately, we've been too much asleep at the wheel as the world's most valuable resource, data, pours into the PRC every single day. That needs to change. Mr. Chairman, it's time for us to get our heads in the game, and I agree with you that the best way to do this is to negotiate and conclude a digital trade agreement. While I do have to admit that a digital sector agreement is a poor substitute for being part of a more comprehensive regional agreement, it's an excellent place to start building U.S. economic ties with our partners throughout the region. Let me close with this. Across the Indo-Pacific countries, Across the Indo-Pacific, countries are hungry for more trade with the U.S., and we can achieve major foreign policy wins by meeting that demand. For example, Taiwan wants a trade deal so much that they finally allowed U.S. pork imports after years of delay. But whether it's digital trade or Taiwan, the administration, unfortunately, has ignored the demand for real trade deals. Instead, they're poised to offer regional economic framework, which simply cannot meet the needs of the moment. Let's hope the president decides to negotiate something more substantial, or I'm afraid Americans will end up having to play by rules that were written in Beijing. And I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Shabbat. Let me now introduce our witnesses. First, we have Ms. Wendy Cutler, Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Ms. Cutler served for nearly 3 decades as a diplomat and negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where she also served as acting Deputy U.S. Trade Representative. Next, we have Ms. Christine Bliss, President of the Coalition of Services Industry. Prior to CSI, Ms. Bliss was Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Services, Investment, Telecommunications, and E-commerce. Last but not least is Mr. David Feith, Adjunct Senior Fellow of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security. He served as U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 2020 to 2021. I thank you all for participating in today's hearing. I will now recognize each witness for 5 minutes. Without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. I will first invite Ms. Cutler for her testimony.
Well, thank you, Chairman Bera and Ranking Member Chabot and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'm honored to have the opportunity to appear before you today, even if virtually. As this subcommittee fully appreciates, the United States must strengthen its economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific. Given the trajectory of regional economic growth and innovation, U.S. prosperity is closely tied to the Indo-Pacific for the years to come. Without a robust regional economic agenda, the United States risks foregoing economic opportunities and also becoming increasingly marginalized as the region forges a new future without us. Furthermore, economic engagement will help strengthen U.S. credibility and influence in this pivotal region. Security partnerships alone will not achieve that. It is therefore encouraging that the administration is now developing an Indo-Pacific economic framework. Since the United States exited the TPP, our regional partners have not slowed down. In fact, the recent 2 regional comprehensive trade deals, CPTPP and RCEP, should serve as a wake-up call for Washington. And China's recent application to join the CPTPP is a potential game changer and must be taken seriously. If the United States doesn't step up its economic game, CPTPP accession negotiations for China will become the most consequential negotiation in the region, with the United States again sitting on the sidelines. And our Indo-Pacific partners are also actively pursuing negotiations in the digital space. In addition to a series of bilateral trade agreements, Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile have concluded a partnership agreement, which could become a platform for a broader regional deal, with Korea and China expressing interest in joining. And now to turn to China, which is building a very different digital future. Indeed, Xi Jinping has described tech innovation as the main battleground of the global playing field. Just last week, China's State Council released an ambitious and detailed 5-year plan on digital aimed at bolstering the role of these technologies in its economy, with goals related to broadband access, digital infrastructure, and emerging tech research. And moreover, the plan lays out Beijing's international intentions, including partnering with ASEAN and the EU, as well as becoming more active on digital matters in international organizations. China's goal to leverage its gravitational pull of its economic heft to create a favorable international environment for its own digital vision, including policies related to cross-border data flows, data privacy, and to the promotion of China-driven technical standards. And let's keep in mind that China's digital future includes worrying efforts to manage access to information, constrain dissent, and carry out monitoring and repression of certain populations. The United States must work with like-minded countries to shape an affirmative alternative to the Chinese approach that advances democratic norms, including transparency, openness, interoperability, and fairness. And in my view, there's no better way to do this than by shaping a robust and forward-leaning digital pillar as the centerpiece of the Indo-Pacific economic framework. Now, there are various approaches for doing this, but I believe the United States would be best served by proposing a new paradigm. And this would involve lifting the most meaningful, inclusive, and impactful elements from existing trade agreements, including the USMCA, while adding new features to promote digital inclusiveness, strengthen consumer confidence and trust, and protect personal information. The goal should be to ensure that the outcomes serve the interest of our workers, consumers, and businesses of all sizes, particularly SMEs. And moreover, a digital economy pillar should be sufficiently flexible to take on the challenges presented by new trends and technologies, including AI and worker force skill development. In pursuing such an approach, extensive consultations with Congress and all stakeholders are critical in order to get this right. And to be impactful as possible, an agreement should include flexibilities to cast a wide net for potential membership, particularly in Southeast Asia, where tech is booming and Chinese tech companies have been aggressively expanding their presence in recent years. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, a bold, meaningful, and impactful and inclusive Indo-Pacific economic framework with a strong digital pillar could go a long way in reasserting U.S. leadership and influence in the region. But time is of the essence. We need to move now to help shape the economic future of the region, or risk becoming observers as others do. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cutler. I'll now recognize Ms. Bliss for her testimony. I don't know if your camera's on, Ms. Bliss. There it is. Great. And
Chairman Meeks and Ranking Member McCall, as well as Ranking Member Subcommittee Ranking Member Shabbat, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in today's hearing to discuss the strategic importance of digital economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific. My name is Christine Bliss. I'm president of the Coalition of Services Industries, and we represent services and digital firms on services and digital trade issues. Our members include firms that provide information technology services, financial services, logistics, media and entertainment, distribution, and professional services. I want to note at the outset that CSI supports the Biden administration intention to develop an Indo-Pacific framework to renew U.S. leadership in the world's fastest growing region, as you noted, Mr. Chairman, in your opening remarks. We believe that all potential aspects of the IPEF, including digital trade, sustainability, supply chain resilience, and labor, are all important. However, in line with the topic of today's hearing, my testimony focuses on the significance of the digital economic engagement pillar. An Indo-Pacific digital trade agreement has received bipartisan congressional support thanks to the leadership of this committee and you, Mr. Chairman, and other members of Congress that recognize the strategic imperative of taking swift action to reassert U.S. leadership in the region. I'd also note, as you did, Mr. Chairman, in your opening remarks, that I believe that USMCA provides a positive process and precedent for the IPEF in light of its broad bipartisan support and robust stakeholder engagement, including with the labor community and others. As Ms. Cutler noted in her testimony, and you did in your opening remarks, and Ranking Member Shabbat's opening remarks, digital engagement in the Indo-Pacific region is an urgent exercise. First, expansion of services in digital trade with the region is critical to supporting existing and future jobs and services in digital sectors in the United States, as well as in supporting manufacturing and other key sectors of the U.S. economy. And this is not just about promoting the interests of large U.S. services and digital firms and professional workers. It is also about creating new opportunities for the 52 million U.S. workers in services occupations earning middle-class wages, which can benefit from the creation of new jobs in digital and digitally enabled services and through their participation in supply chains. It is also vitally important to micro, small, and medium-sized businesses, which increasingly depend on access to broadband, internet platforms, and the latest digital applications in the cloud to expand their domestic and international reach. Second, digital engagement in the region is essential to combat rising protectionism, even among our closest allies in the region. Data localization and data residency requirements are proliferating. And they don't only pose major trade barriers, but they also enable increased authoritarian influence, censorship, and surveillance, and leave networks vulnerable to cybersecurity risks. U.S. engagement in the region's digital economy is also important to counteracting China's protectionist and authoritarian whole-of-government approach to shaping the rules of the road on digital trade. Ms. Cutler alerted to the recently announced 5-year plan by China to even tighten its grips on data sovereignty and to expand its reach on digital policies internationally. China also recently concluded the RCEP and had a great influence on the standards on digital trade in that regard, which were incredibly weak. And this is important because RCEP is the world's largest trading bloc, accounting for 30% of global GDP. China's application to accede to regional agreements like CPTPP and the Digital Economy Partnership are also of great concern. Additionally, as has been noted, U.S. allies like Japan, the UK, Australia, Singapore, New Zealand, Korea, and other nations are expanding their digital networks while the U.S. is not, and is at serious risk of being left behind. In the words of Singapore's Deputy Prime Minister Heng Swee-Keat, the U.S. cannot afford to be absent from the region's evolving economic architecture, if not through CPTPP, that it must have an equally substantially alternative. Finally, the digital aspects of IPEF and any associated digital agreement should include world-class digital provisions applying to all services sectors. It should promote worker skill training, particularly for women, small businesses, and historically marginalized communities. The IPEF should be accompanied by a regional digital agreement with like-minded allies, including Japan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and Korea, and should be binding and enforceable. My written testimony also includes an annex recommending specific provisions to be included in such an agreement. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the opportunity to testify today and appreciate the subcommittee's attention to these critical issues.
Thank you, Ms. Bliss. I now invite Mr. Feith for his testimony.
Thanks very much, Chairman Bera, Ranking Member Shabbat, and all the distinguished subcommittee members. I appreciate very much the opportunity to speak with you about digital trade with the Indo-Pacific and more broadly, the strategic importance of data rules. I wish to stress 3 main points today. First, a U.S. digital trade agreement in the Indo-Pacific would indeed serve American interests economically and strategically. Second, such an agreement is by no means all that is needed. Our country should improve our overall approach to digital trade, starting by curbing the massive and currently unregulated flows of sensitive data from the United States to China. Third, U.S. diplomacy should seek to cooperate with allies on both of these tracks, to expand digital trade among friends and to limit it with China. The case for expanding U.S. digital trade in the Indo-Pacific is strong, as we've heard, because digital trade is important and the Indo-Pacific is important. There are various ways that we could craft better digital trade rules in the Indo-Pacific, and as we've discussed, the general contours of a desirable deal are visible from previous U.S. agreements. Parties would agree not to impose tariffs on each other's digital content. Parties would agree not to force technology transfer as a condition of market access. Parties would agree in general to open cross-border data flows, meaning they would limit data localization. The more that our Indo-Pacific allies and partners honor rules like these, the better for regional economic development and for U.S. interests. There are notable risks in our current approach, however. It is not nearly enough to expand digital trade with our partners. We also need to limit our digital trade with China. Our most urgent digital trade challenge, in fact, may not be in the Indo-Pacific, but at home. It is how to begin placing overdue national security controls on data flows to and from China. China's approach to digital trade has long been far more strategic, mercantilist, and non-reciprocal than U.S. policy has recognized. The Chinese Communist Party has developed a comprehensive strategy to control, accumulate, and exploit data. Data such as personal health records, personal genetic sequences, and personal online browsing habits. Data such as corporate trade secrets, corporate supply chain records, and corporate financial accounts. Data such as the photos, voice recordings, and mapping imagery pushed through phones, drones, and smart cars all around the world. Beijing recognizes that the competition for global influence in the 21st century will require protecting and harnessing this data to achieve commercial, technological, military, and intelligence advantages. And that's what it is doing. As we've heard, Beijing has built a latticework of laws and regulations to make the Chinese Communist Party effectively the world's most powerful data broker. This has a huge impact on foreign firms operating in China. Not only must their Chinese data stay in China and be accessible by the Chinese state, but Beijing now demands control over whether they can send it to their own headquarters, or to a corporate lab in, say, California, or to a foreign government that has made a lawful regulatory or law enforcement request. Beijing's approach is nakedly non-reciprocal. It relies on access to data from foreign countries while denying foreigners access to data from China. In China, Beijing controls the data of foreign companies. Outside of China, Chinese companies operate comfortably, creating and accessing valuable new data sets primed for easy transfer back to China in all manner of data-intensive fields: biotech, pharma, medical devices, drones, autonomous cars and trucks, social media, digital payments, e-commerce, and more. These data flows to China contain massive quantities of American information. All this is the stuff of digital trade, yet there are effectively no rules governing any of it. In this environment for upwards of a generation, Beijing has been coldly effective in designing a strategy of global data mercantilism, data hoarding for me, data relinquishing for thee. The Biden administration has spoken about the importance of data in our competition with China, but no visible strategy has yet emerged. The US government traditionally has no mechanism for limiting cross-border data flows, even on national security grounds. When an American teenager wants to download a Chinese social media app onto her phone, or a US university wants to exchange biotech research with a Chinese university, or a US state government wants to use Chinese drones for power grid surveillance, the US government has no way to regulate this activity to protect important American interests. Washington has begun to address this gap only recently through the creation, at least on paper, of the new ICTS regulatory regime for reviewing cross-border data flows. But the ICTS process has not yet been put to use. Apart from ICTS, the Congress could, of course, consider legislative approaches, and various bills have been proposed to limit the ability of Chinese social media apps to operate and collect data in the US, but without success. Another idea is to create a new export control regime that would restrict bulk personal data from going to foreign adversaries. But that, too, has not garnered much apparent support. I'll close by noting quickly how, as we struggle to develop new standards for our own digital trade with China, it'll be difficult to harmonize our approach with partners overseas. But overcoming this challenge is essential if we are to create a favorable global digital order. We've discussed China's interest in joining the CPTPP. China wants to do so chiefly to influence its currently high standards and to protect thereby China's more mercantilist and authoritarian interests. CPTPP members have a veto over this and should use it. Important as it is, however, to keep Beijing from entering CPTPP against the rules will hardly be sufficient for shaping the future of trade in Asia. As we've said, fashioning a high-standard Indo-Pacific digital trade agreement would be a good step, and so would beginning to impose reasonable national security restrictions on US-China data flows. The concept that combines these two elements, digital trade expansion with friends and digital trade limitation with rivals, is what former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe called data free flow with trust. We should maximize data trade with those we can trust and limit data trade with those we cannot. This won't be easy given China's size, strength, and deep integration into our digital economy and that of our allies, but it's necessary. Our responsibility now that we recognize increasingly that data is a strategic resource, is to design a global digital trade order that reflects democratic values and not Beijing's. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Thank you. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes each, and pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I will recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know and we will circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. With that, I will start by recognizing myself. Again, I appreciate the work that the ranking member, Mr. Shabbat, and I have been doing on this, as well as the other subcommittee members. And Ms. Cutler, in your opening testimony, I know both of us worked together during the Obama administration, to get TPA passed and TPP, and it, was a somewhat contentious deal, and ultimately we didn't get it across the finish line. That said, in the last administration, there was a lot of work on the renegotiation of NAFTA. All parties were brought to the table. I've had conversation with some of the labor negotiators and others, and everybody didn't get what they wanted, but it did demonstrate a process and ultimately led to a strong bipartisan vote where I think in the House, there were more House Democrats that actually voted for that bill than House Republicans. So it does show an open process with all stakeholders at the table, labor, the environmental groups, the business community and others, that we can actually get a trade deal across the finish line. So it is, again, something that we're very supportive of the Biden administration pursuing. Maybe the first question would go to Ms. Cutler. You outlined a few of the existing policies. There's a digital trade chapter in USMCA. There's the bilateral that we have between the United States and Japan. You also touched on the Singapore, New Zealand, Chile deal, which it seems to be a more modular deal. If you could expand on these different options and potentially where a good starting point would be.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there's so much digital activity going on in the region. Singapore has really been instrumental in seeking bilateral agreements with other countries, and they recently concluded a deal with Korea. At the same time, Singapore is part of this regional effort with Chile and New Zealand with this so-called Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. And I think both these agreements in the region without us, as well as drawing from the USMCA and US-Japan bilateral digital agreement, really provides a great starting point for the United States. I don't think we should dock on to any of the agreements in the region, because I think they all need to be updated and improved and reflect more effectively labor and consumer concerns that we're hearing in the United States. But my sense is that our regional partners and allies are very excited about working with us in this area. They're not waiting for us, but they're welcoming.
Great. Thank you for that. And I have to second that. I can't have a conversation with Australians or our friends in New Zealand or Singapore or Indonesia without this topic coming up. And there really is a strong desire in the region for the United States to engage and help come up with a high standard agreement that really does set the rules of the road. Mr. Feith, you talked a little bit about some of the risks of what China is doing in terms of data privacy and the like. Can you outline or maybe expand on the risks that we face if we don't actually set a high standard trade deal?
Certainly, the risks if we fail to set standards in the region include that China's model, which it inherently uses to exert influence over not just foreign companies, but foreign countries, the approach of foreign countries to not just matters of economics and trade, but also matters of political and foreign policy decision making. Beijing will have a freer hand to dictate terms. They can do that either by getting inside these institutions, as we've discussed. If these institutions like CPTPP don't hold by their own standards, if they were over the years to be pressured by Beijing and to make the decision that even though it would frankly make nonsense of the rules and standards that CPP is supposed to stand for, to bring in China when China's data regime is what it is, when China's labor regime is what it is, when its approach to state-owned enterprises is what it is. But obviously these forces are subject to politics. And Beijing will indeed be pressing to work its way in both inside these institutions or from the outside. If the institutions are not sufficiently strong, Beijing will be able to exert itself on other countries and won't have the collective market and sort of policy power of these countries working together in these trade blocs, exerting influence on Beijing, which is what over time we would prefer.
Another place there too.
Great. And I noticed my time's expired, so thank you for that. Let me go ahead and recognize the ranking member, Mr. Shabbat, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Feith, I'll begin with you. Neither this administration nor the previous one showed particular interest in new trade deals in the Indo-Pacific. That's essentially left the State Department to champion economic engagement, which it's been attempting to do, but without the heft of the USTR. What opportunities are we missing in the region with the White House holding USTR on such a tight leash?
Well, thanks for that, Congressman Shabbat. The experience that I had at the State Department reflected very much what you said, and I will say, to the extent that we're speaking broadly about economic engagement with the Indo-Pacific, it is worth noting that in addition to the tools that we have, the formal trade negotiation tools that obviously are led by USTR, in addition to some of the general diplomatic and economic diplomacy tools that are wielded by the State Department, there are additional very important tools, including some that have been sharpened and strengthened by this committee over the years, to include the International Development Finance Corporation and the Exim Bank. These are both also important for making sure that American trade and investment in this vital region are as substantial as possible, and therefore the American influence is too. But I think, as your question suggests, there is still a power in broad trade deals properly negotiated that can be, among the strongest tools that we have. And it is interesting the ways that in different administrations and sometimes with continuity across administrations, the dynamics between the White House, USTR, and state function. One thing that we observed in the last administration with some interest was questions about whether the bandwidth constraints of USTR in terms of personnel and the number of hours in the day could be mitigated through personnel transfers, where larger parts of the government, like the State Department or others, could lend personnel to build out trade missions, the ability to visit more countries and have more negotiations. Those were, I think, interesting issues which merit additional consideration, if I could suggest that.
Thank you. Let me ask you this: what consequences do we face if we fail to compete with China in the trade arena, relative to our economy, to strategic competition more generally? I'll just leave it there.
Well, China under Xi Jinping has a fundamentally different view of the future of the world than we do, and than our allies and partners all around the world do. They have a frankly intensely adversarial and hostile view toward our interests and our values. And so, to the extent that we cede competitive ground to them, to the extent that we let them continue to advance in their economic and technology goals without competing properly, without making ourselves more resilient against their subversion, without making our allies and partners stronger and more resilient in that fashion, the consequences could be absolutely severe for control and hegemony in Asia and globally.
Thank you. Ms. Bliss, let me try to get a question, one more in here. History shows, I believe, that the wealthiest countries tend to be those that have been successful in the trade arena. Could you discuss some of the economic benefits to the U.S. if we could negotiate a digital trade deal with countries in the Indo-Pacific?
Absolutely. Thank you, Congressman Shabbat. So it's critically important for services and digital trade, and the services and digital firms that I represent, and more broadly in the economy, but also because those firms also support other economic sectors like agriculture, like manufacturing. And as I think you noted in your opening remarks, there is tremendous growth potential in the Asia Pacific, particularly in countries like Malaysia and Vietnam, Indonesia. And so the digital aspect of that is very, very important to creating and supporting U.S. jobs in digital and digitally enabled services related areas. Just to give you an example, total U.S. services digital exports are 500 billion. Out of that, just in the Asia Pacific, 180 billion in services exports, 124 billion of that total are digital. And that is just the beginning. We believe there is tremendous growth potential there in that regard. So the benefits of tapping into the region with strong digital with rules are tremendously important. And as I noted, not just to the large firms in services and digital trade, but also to the smaller firms in particular that rely on digital tools to expand their reach to domestic and to global markets, and particularly women and minorities. 90% of minority businesses are small businesses. And so the benefits, I think, are quite large. If I can add a couple of things to, I think, a question that you asked and also that the chairman asked, in terms of the consequences of not having a strong Indo-Pacific strategy and counteracting China also include the fact of China's widening influence in multilateral institutions, whether it's the WTO, APEC, or the ITU, and in standard settings bodies in particular. And so an Indo-Pacific digital agreement, MOU, whatever form it would take, should include addressing standards and for digitally enabled services, because that is another area where we really face a huge challenge from China. And then finally, I also wanted to emphasize with respect to China, that China heavily influenced the outcome in the RCEP negotiations. And as a result, the digital disciplines are unfortunately full of exceptions, and they're quite weak, particularly in areas such as data localization, restrictions on cross-border data flows, and provisions that champion domestic industries. So we don't want that to become the model throughout the Asia-Pacific region. So I know I went beyond the specific outlines of your question, but I just wanted to add a couple of points to the question that you and the chairman raised.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Let me go ahead and recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes of questioning.
I would ask that you'd go on to the next Democrat and then have me be the Democrat after that.
You're muted, Mr. Bera.
Let me recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. This is a really important hearing. I want to focus on some of the privacy concerns associated with the digital trade components of the agreements we've been discussing here today. Today's tech giants have a nearly unfettered ability to collect, store, transfer, and use personal data from their customers around the world for their own profit. The US has thus far failed effectively to regulate the tech sector here at home to ensure that consumer privacy rights are protected, particularly compared to European data regulations. Ms. Bliss, in your testimony, you expressed support for a, quote, US-led high-standard digital trade agreement in the Indo-Pacific region, end quote. Could you expand on what those high standards would look like in practice, particularly when it comes to privacy rights, please?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I think that you're absolutely right that privacy protection is extremely important. And I will say that I think action on federal privacy legislation is very important as part of that and as a foundation to address the patchwork of state level privacy laws that exist now. So just foundationally, I think that's an important point. I think that there are important privacy related provisions that have been included in the UMCA and other agreements.
Ms. Bliss, if you could turn your camera on.
Sorry about that. I do think there are important provisions that have been included in previous digital provisions agreements such as USMCA, the US-Japan agreement, for example, ensuring that parties have an adequate privacy framework domestically. I think—
Can I just ask you, Ms. Bliss, does your organization represent the big tech companies that the tech giants of the United States? Are they part of your organization?
I do have a number of tech companies that are members. They are not the majority of my membership by any means, but yes, they are included.
Some of like Alphabet and whatever Facebook calls itself now, or Apple, or these Amazon, any of them.
Not Apple, but yes.
Okay, well, does your coalition support European privacy protections?
No, we have not taken a position on that. However, we have been of the view that it is possible to ensure privacy protection in a way that recognizes the European right to enforce the GDPR in terms of working out digital trade rules with respect to cross-border data transfer.
Okay. All right. Let me try to get in one more question. That's helpful. Thank you. So U.S. competition with China obviously looms large in this discussion, particularly in terms of setting standards, the rules of the road for future digital trade norms and practices. And obviously, China's own initiatives and its participation in multilateral agreements are already shaping the digital trade sphere, as some of you have said. Let me ask Ms. Cutler, how can we ensure that U.S. engagement in digital trade and future agreements doesn't perpetuate a race to the bottom in terms of competitive business standards? And what policies or norms would you suggest that we champion in digital trade agreements that would allow us to compete effectively with China, but still protect consumer rights, the privacy rights I was talking about before?
Well, thank you, Congressman Levin. That's a good question. And I emphasize in my testimony that I really think we need an affirmative agenda here. This isn't about, we shouldn't just focus on countering China, but let's set the stage for what's important to us. And protection of data is important. Cross-border data flows is also important. Digital inclusiveness is important. The norms of non-discrimination and fairness is important. So in my view, that's kind of the approach we should take. Of course, in the back of our minds is China, but that cannot be the driver. We should, again, assert an affirmative positive agenda. And I think that will gain a lot more traction in the Indo-Pacific region with our allies and partners, and frankly, other countries that are kind of sitting on the fence.
All right, thanks, Mr. Chairman. It looks like my time's expired. I yield back.
Great, thank you. Let me now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Chairman Bera. For any of our panelists who might want to answer, I'd like to glean a little more information as to the expectations for a bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan. I mean, given the fact that Taiwan has repeatedly demonstrated its good faith interest in negotiating with the United States, what do you think is the appetite within the Biden administration for a free trade agreement with Taiwan? And do you think we can expect anything like that within the next few years? Any panelist that wishes to answer that?
Perhaps I'll take a shot at it, and I cannot speak for the Biden administration, and I don't know exactly where they are in these discussions. But what I have gleaned from my conversations with administration officials is that there's a real commitment to strengthen, expand, and deepen our economic relations with Taiwan. And just in the past year, we have seen, for example, USTR reinvigorate the TIFA, the Trade Investment Framework Agreement, and set up working groups. We've seen the State Department and Commerce also set up bilateral channels dealing with supply chains, technologies, green technologies, et cetera. So I think there is robust and unprecedented economic engagement with Taiwan. And again, I can't speak, is that sufficient, or is the administration envisioning, that at some point, maybe when they're ready to do free trade agreements, that they would look to Taiwan to conclude such an agreement?
Okay, thank you. Anybody else wish to weigh in?
I would just, Congressman, I would just say I would agree with Wendy's assessment that I think that given the current administration's reluctance to, at least at this point, proceed with trade agreements, probably that may not be realistic in the near term to expect. However, as Wendy pointed out, there has been a much higher level and interest in engagement in various ways with Taiwan, which I think is encouraging. So that seems to be the likeliest outcome, at least in the near term.
All right. I mean, I appreciate the sentiment. I feel like we're tiptoeing, and look, you're just here to help inform us, but we're tiptoeing around the circumstance with Taiwan and China, trying to not offend China. At the same time, China has no problem offending us or the rest of the world, and we've got a great trading partner right next door that's been honest and true with us all along. And I just personally, I think we ought to be more robust and forceful in that. But given maybe that, I would consider the administration is dithering establishing trade policies in the Indo-Pacific. And to me, that maybe indicates a lack of consensus among U.S. officials. But do you guys think that individual trade agreements, digital trade agreements with some of the friendly partner nations is a plausible way to go as opposed to something far more reaching? Do you think that the individual trade agreements is what we really have to hope for with some of these more allied countries to us?
Congressman, I would just respond by saying that it appears that the administration is pursuing bilaterally with some key allies in the region, whether it be Singapore or others, that be making a visit to Indonesia and have been in Indonesia, and will be going to ASEAN. So that seems to be the approach, bilateral approach. However, I think from our perspective, we would hope, at least with respect to digital trade, that there would be the prospect for a regional digital agreement to avoid a patchwork of agreements that could have differing standards. I think there are obviously negative commercial implications of that, of having differing standards. But there's also, I think, the China angle too, which is, I think a regional digital agreement would have stronger force and the ability to counteract some of the negative policies that we've been talking about with respect to China. So again, I think it's a preference rather than a reflection of where the administration is. But I think from our perspective, we would hope that there is the possibility of doing a regional Asia-Pacific digital agreement, at least initially, with like-minded countries.
I sure hope so. I agree with you. I think that the regional framework is what we're seeking. Just don't know if it's possible, and I'm just wondering if the individual agreements where you get started with something would set the tone for a regional framework, even though you did it piece by piece by piece. It's not optimal, but at least we can get there. So I appreciate your input. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance.
Great, thank you. Let me now recognize the gentleman from California and Mr. Sherman for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. First, I want to emphasize that while there's a lot of support for rejoining TPP here in Washington, TPP is DOA with the American people. We saw this in 2016, where every presidential candidate opposed TPP, and the people voted for the presidential candidate who seemed most passionate in his opposition. In 2020, no presidential candidate thought that they could sell TPP to the American people. So we should be focusing here, and I think we are focusing here, on specific agreements dealing with digital, because the American people probably can't be convinced that goods made at 35 cents an hour in Vietnam should have free access to the U.S. market over the dead bodies of the labor leaders killed by that regime. When we focus on China, they have tremendous power in our government and in our society because of the economic relationship, but it is not reciprocal. There are no lobbyists in Beijing working for trading partners of American companies or American companies themselves influencing Chinese policy. But the power that China has over Congress because of its economic relationships is enormous. For that reason, we rarely even threaten the much higher tariffs that would need to be threatened to eliminate what is the largest and most pernicious trade deficit in the history of the world. When we focus on digital, one important aspect of that is entertainment. And we've seen the power of the Chinese government. As NBA stars fawn over each other as to who can apologize most for how the Uyghurs are treated. Or in my own city in Hollywood, where studios know that they won't have access to the Chinese markets if they ever make a movie about Tibet. The scathing reports have been issued by the Global Federation of Labor, the ITUC, and the Global Service Sector Labor Federation, PSI. Now, without objection, I would like to enter both these reports into the record. They raise the issue of whether, through these international treaties, big tech can handcuff Congress before we can regulate them, before we can deal with monopolistic abuses, and can lock in a regulatory scheme favorable to themselves, which Congress can't change without the permission of dozens of other countries. But I want to focus also on financial services. As you know, I chair the Capital Markets Subcommittee. There we saw Morgan Stanley, in effect, forced to recommend that its customers buy more Chinese stock in order to get access to the Chinese market. But I want to focus on one particular aspect of this. Ms. Bliss, we've got to ensure that financial services firms are protected from the threat of forced data localization. That's one area where we have bipartisan agreement, and both in the industry and from U.S. leadership. Do you agree that the Biden administration should build on that foundation against this effort by many countries, but especially China, to say all the data has to be kept in that country so that then oppressive governments can have access to that data to oppress their people? How should the Biden administration prevent these data localization initiatives?
Thank you, Congressman Sherman. And you really hit on what is one of our top digital priorities. We believe that data localization is pernicious, unjustified, and that I think the U.S. itself has worked out ways to ensure that regulators can get the information that they need. And if they can't, they can resort to data localization, looking at the precedent that we set on financial services in the USMCA financial services chapter. So we think that's a good balance and a good way to combat. But I absolutely agree that the elimination of data localization continues to be a major priority in the Indo-Pacific, where it is, unfortunately, a continuing problem, even among allies like Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam. It's a huge problem. And so I think prohibiting data localization has to be a continuing priority, no question. And let me also say there's also a jobs.
The regime in Ho Chi Minh City is, and Hanoi is not an ally of the United States. And I look forward to a more formal regulatory dialogue with China, as we have with the UK and India, on these digital issues. And I yield back.
Great. Thank you. Let me now recognize the gentlelady from Missouri for 5 minutes of questioning. Ms. Wagner.
Yes, I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses certainly for their time and expertise. As co-chair of the ASEAN caucus, I am glad that this committee is examining the critical importance of trade and economic ties in the Indo-Pacific. China is determined to expand its influence throughout the region by subverting, replacing, or blocking the global rules and norms that the United States has championed for decades. Our partners in Southeast Asia are being increasingly targeted by China and are just absolutely desperate for the United States to show leadership and commitment. Sadly, this administration has neglected to offer, I think, a robust and specific plan to deepen U.S. economic engagement in the region. The United States should be laying out a clear, a concrete and a detailed roadmap for expanding economic and trade ties with Southeast Asia. My Southeast Asia Strategy Act, which I am proud to say was signed into law December 27th of 2021, will require the administration to do just that. China wants to rewrite global economic rules, especially in the digital economy and other emergent sectors. The United States must be proactive in shoring up existing international standards and building out the foundational agreements for the economies of the future. This is why I was pleased to join Representatives Bera and Shabbat in calling on the administration to immediately begin negotiating a digital trade agreement for the Indo-Pacific. Vague promises to, quote, explore an economic framework for the Indo-Pacific will simply not be enough. China has already taken a number of actions to exert control over the development of digital trade rules, including by convening the PRC-led Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. RCEP includes extremely concerning digital policy provisions that benefit China's authoritarian model of digital regulation. I worry that if the United States allows RCEP to form the basis for international digital standards, there will be serious ramifications, especially for human rights. Ms. Bliss, how do RCEP digital provisions advantage authoritarian governments and help dictators restrict free speech and target vulnerable groups?
Thank you, Congresswoman, and thank you for the work as you co-chair the ASEAN caucus and also for the legislation.
Ms. Bliss, I'd have you turn your camera on if you can.
Your camera's off.
Sorry. Now it's on. Thank you. And so thank you for your work in this area. I think it's extremely important. And I think that it is critically important that the administration, as you say, come out with a concrete plan. And I think our view would be that there are significant provisions that need to be added. And we need to we need to build on USMCA and the agreement we negotiated with Japan on digital.
Yeah, let me just say that I'm concerned about this Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that is PRC led.
Yes. No, I was going to get to that.
So I have very limited time and more questions, please.
Right. So on RCEP, the way that it is so concerning is that there are flexibilities built in so that members of RCEP can not observe various disciplines. Two, the data localization provisions are—
Thank you, Ms. Bliss. Thank you. I'm going to reclaim my time here. Let me ask another question. It's very clear that China also hopes to use digital rulemaking to insulate itself from sanctions and other economic consequences of their human rights abuses and violations of international laws. Ms. Bliss, if the United States does not take swift action to negotiate digital trade agreements, how might the PRC use digital rules to weaken our sanctions regime? How do we prevent this?
Well, again, if we don't get involved, I think fortunately there are other nations who are building a network that we're unfortunately outside of and will not benefit from. But I think that the PRC is being successful, both in terms of trying to extend its influence by joining CPTPP and also DEPA. And so I think that's a threat that we need to face. And so to your question, as I understand it, is what kind of a threat does China really pose? And I think it's through the potential of joining CPTPP, DEPA, as well as its ongoing activities multilaterally.
Okay, thank you. My time's expired. I appreciate the chairman's indulgence. And Mr. Chairman, I have some other questions I will submit for the record. And I thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Ms. Wagner. Let me now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Bera, for holding this important hearing. My question goes to Mr. Feith. The problems you identified seems to go more towards the fact that you have authoritarian countries versus free and open societies like the United States. So one reason that Russia was able to successfully execute, as our Department of Justice found, a sweeping and systematic attack of US elections in 2016 is because in the US, we don't censor what people post on Twitter or Facebook. The fact that China can do all sorts of things to software companies and other businesses in China is very different than the US, where our own Supreme Court has made it difficult to even patent a number of kinds of software. So when we have a free and open society, how is it that if we do any of these trade agreements, it will affect any of the concerns that you identified in your testimony? I'm just sort of curious how that would address the harms that you put out.
Yes, thanks, Connor, for the question. I think that, of course, the difference that you point out, that is so fundamental between free and open society and an authoritarian society is enormous. And I think that there are areas where the problems of non-reciprocal trade and non-reciprocal digital trade and data exchange, essentially there are areas where we wouldn't be able to pursue remedies, and we wouldn't want to pursue remedies for the reasons that you say. If a reciprocal remedy is to try to set up in America a censorship regime that looks like China's, that's not appealing. But there are many other areas where I think an approach of a pursuit of a degree of reciprocity would be entirely consistent still with a free and open society at home. Would be beneficial for national security interests around things like the protection of sensitive personal medical or genomic data, access to sensitive types of laboratories, corporate or academic, access to other sensitive sectors. And I think some of these could be affected, reformed and improved by U.S. regulation or law in a fashion that's entirely consistent with remaining a free and open society here.
So what we're talking about is not any digital trade agreement with China, right? It's with other countries. So I'm just still trying to understand how this would sort of address the harms that you say are emanating from countries like China.
Oh, well, actually, my point was that there are certain benefits to derive from a digital trade agreement in the Indo-Pacific, but they are largely separate from the additional very important digital trade related tasks of beginning to scrutinize and then selectively restrict some of the types of data exchange that we have with China. We wouldn't do that through a digital trade agreement with China. We would do that through mechanisms like this new ICTS regime, which is an interagency regime led by the Commerce Department, or you could do it through some of the legislative proposals that have emerged on the Hill. But no, the idea is not that that would be done through a trade agreement.
So I'm a recovering computer science major, and I see how quickly technology moves. I believe it is impossible to stop technology. At most, we might be able to regulate it at its edges. Just look at TikTok. Try to ban it. Like, good luck with that, right? We saw what happened. With Uber, what we saw happen is largely, my view is Uber broke a bunch of laws at the very beginning, but they went ahead and just did it. People liked the service, and now people use it. And so when digital technology moves that quickly, I have concerns about any sorts of regulation from Congress or treaties where it'd be very hard to change if we get it wrong. Now, having said that, I do know we do have digital free trade agreements with Australia, with Japan, with South Korea, with a number of other countries. So my question is, well, why don't we just do that? What if we simply went ahead and to Singapore and say, hey, why don't we do a digital free trade agreement? To Indonesia, why don't we do that? Or to New Zealand and so on? Why not just do it country by country? And that's any member of the panel.
And perhaps I can just respond. I just think doing these types of agreements bilaterally doesn't produce the same kind of impactful result that you'll get from working with a whole group of countries. And by getting a group of countries to agree to common rules, common standards, and common norms, it's much more impactful and frankly develops kind of a collective reaffirmation of the types of democratic principles and values that that we're advocating. So again, you can do it bilaterally, but I'm not sure why you would want to.
Thank you.
If I can quickly jump in and
Gentleman's time's expired. Let me go and recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett, for 5 minutes of questioning. I think you're on mute.
Well, I was making a plea for bipartisanship. I was going to say, ask Ted Lieu if he'd stay on for a minute and let her finish answering. She wanted to answer that question, and I was curious about that myself. If you'll go, and I'll yield my time to do that. Just take a little bit because I'm going to cut you off.
Ms. Bliss,
Chairman, was I recognized? I apologize.
No, Mr. Burchett, and I think he's allowing Ms. Bliss.
Committee, so, okay.
Ms. Bliss, I think Mr. Burchett's allowing you some time to answer that question.
well, you're very kind, Congressman. Thank you. Just very quickly, 2 points. One is, and I think this came out in Congressman Liu's question, but also in a previous question that was posed, and that is that all of U.S. trade agreements and enshrine the principle of the right to regulate. And I think that's a very important point to make in terms of concerns about the degree to which a trade agreement can constrain what the U.S. government can do legislatively or administratively. So that's point one. And then point two, I would just wanted to add that I think in terms of emerging technologies and how swiftly things are changing, an important point to make is one of the innovative provisions that the UK has included in its FTAs, which I think we ought to take a close look at as well, is a regulatory sandbox for digital regulation. And I think enshrining that and making that part of it is a good way of addressing the rapidly changing and evolving digital landscape. Thank you. Thank you again very much for the extra time.
Yes, ma'am. I don't agree with Ted Lieu on much, but I wanted to hear what he's been my buddy, so I wanted to make sure he got the answer on that. What can be done to protect against the Chinese Communist Party gaining control over our undersea fiber optic cables and over the data that flows through them? Anybody can answer that, please.
Well, I'm happy to take that, sir. On undersea cables, I think broadly, somewhat crudely, there are perhaps three broad categories. One is the question of whether we, as the U.S. government, support undersea cables being built directly from our country to China. That's something that the FCC basically put an end to over the course of the last several years. They stopped issuing new landing licenses for cables of that kind, I believe in very early 2017. And then in June of 2020 or so, they undid a previously granted plan that would have connected Los Angeles to Hong Kong. That was the Pacific Light Cable Network. And they said they're not going to license that to turn on to touch from London, or rather from Los Angeles to Hong Kong. It's only going to go Los Angeles to Taiwan and the Philippines. So the landing license matter that the FCC has authority over is one big one, but there are two other major areas of this that also would seem to relate to American data integrity and allied data integrity, which is to what extent Chinese companies like the former Huawei subsidiary HMN Tech are welcomed to build cables that, if not touching the US, connect to other allies and partners of ours. So for example, HMN Tech actually just landed for the first time in France. I believe this might have been the first time they landed in a NATO country. They landed
They were prior, but prior to that, they were Huawei, right? They just changed their name to HMN. Is that pretty much the case?
That's right. Huawei Marine was a subsidiary of the Huawei we all know.
I get it. Yeah.
It's a bit of a bit of a corporate shell game, but yes, it's the same company. They build cables, and so I think there's a question that is a question for us about allied consultations and diplomacy, which is how much do we make it clear to our friends that we consider this a major data integrity risk when allied countries with whom we have sensitive communications might be inviting this Huawei affiliate into their critical telecommunications infrastructure to build new cables. Then there's also the related matter of the maintenance of existing cables,
Okay.
where again,
I'm going to run out of time, but hang on, David, I'm going to run out of time. What can we do to stop that?
well, again, I think at home you have domestic licensing authorities, which the FCC has been using. Diplomatically, we can encourage friends, to include the French and others, to reconsider these sorts of landings. There are also essentially there are authorities, for example, like DFC financing and EXIM export credit that allow the U.S. Or even the Japanese and European competitors of these Chinese undersea cable firms to give certain bidders more competitive pricing, because Huawei, in classic Chinese fashion, seeks to underbid and win contracts that way. And I think all of those measures are things that we should take very seriously, as you're suggesting.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and recognize the gentlelady from Virginia, Ms. Spanberger, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. I have long been concerned about China's growing influence as a leading supplier of 5G technology. Chinese control of this important telecom technology could threaten the privacy, the data, the security of American companies, and certainly American consumers. So last Congress, I was very proud to introduce and pass, with a vote of 413 to 3, legislation that would require the administration to develop and plan a counter-Chinese monopoly plan and trajectory for us in the 5G space. And most recently, I was proud to co-sponsor, vote for, and see signed into law the bipartisan Secure Equipment Act of 2021 to remove potentially harmful equipment from our nation's communication networks. And so as sort of follow-up to this landscape of what we've done so far, I'm curious, how could U.S. engagement with Indo-Pacific countries foster a more diverse, resilient, or secure telecommunications ecosystem that supports our domestic priorities while also expanding our engagement in the region? And I'll open it up to any of the witnesses who may want to speak to that, either in agreement or in disagreement with the premise of my question.
Well, I'll start. I'm in total agreement with the premise of your question. The whole idea of working with our partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific is to kind of build that ecosystem that reflects, again, our values, our norms, our priorities, taking into account their concerns and priorities as well. But the more we can work with them and develop this ecosystem, it's not going to be static. It will continue to expand into other areas, particularly as technology develops. So I think, you are right on the mark with your question. And I think that's one of the important elements and really the urgency now of working with our countries to build the that ecosystem.
And looking at building that ecosystem, are there any suggestions that you all, again, I'll open this up to any of the witnesses, would make to members of this committee in terms of either legislatively or kind of things we should be thinking about as we are looking towards our partners and potential increased partnerships in the Indo-Pacific? Are there any things that you would point us to or things that you think we should be focusing on from a congressional standpoint?
Congressman, I'll try to take that quickly. One thing that I think the U.S. government has learned in recent years, sometimes through difficulty and frustration, is that as we try to make our own policy and consult with our friends about policy on the sorts of telecommunications infrastructure matters that you've raised, there's sometimes a problem of an inability to address the full relevant technology stack.
Mm-hmm.
And in some the previous question about undersea cables reflects that, where we had an explosion in interest over the last 5 years, let's say, in 5G, where we basically ended up focusing our diplomacy aggressively and with some success, but quite narrowly on the matter of terrestrial hardware. Which base stations for terrestrial systems will our allies and partners install? And that is extremely important. But all of the same concerns apply to undersea cables. All of the same concerns apply to data centers and cloud. All of the same concerns apply throughout that process. And we, in our system, and very much with allies and partners, we found in our diplomacy that often, unless we made specific point that actually the concern that is about terrestrial also relates to undersea, it also relates to cloud, our counterparts wouldn't naturally make the inference. And I think as we do policy and legislating, we might fruitfully bear that in mind.
And Mr. Feith, you mentioned multiple times the diplomatic engagement and, through our diplomatic discussions. And so I would just note that we do need to have a very strong diplomatic presence across Asia. So I am personally, and I think many of my colleagues share this concern, that so many of our ambassador positions across the region, especially in Southeast Asia, have gone unfilled in some cases for years. And so I think that it certainly has an impact on our ability to cooperate on shared U.S. interests, to include putting a check on Chinese expansionism, but also bolstering public health in the response to COVID. And so I wonder if you, in the closing moments that we have left, have any comments on that in terms of the necessity and value of having those positions filled.
I would agree. It's extremely valuable, and the sooner the better.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you very much for this hearing.
Great, thank you. Let me now recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for your testimony. Let me especially thank Mr. Feith for what I think is the most salient point of this entire hearing in his prepared testimony when he quoted General Secretary Xi Jinping in talking about data. And I'll quote from Mr. Feith's testimony what the Chinese leader said. Quote, "The vast ocean of data, just like oil resources during industrialization, contains immense productive power and opportunities. Whoever controls big data technologies will control the resources for development and have the upper hand. Make no mistake, that is the modus operandi of the Chinese Communist Party. Beijing indeed recognizes that competition for global influence in the 21st century will require harnessing this data, dominating this data to achieve commercial, technological, military, and intelligence advantages. That is what it is doing. I want to flag that testimony. I want to highlight it. I want to underline it. That is what this hearing is all about, and we need to compete, and we need to counter that threat. So, Mr. Feith, in response to that, and also I would invite our other witnesses to chime in here. Tell us about the extent to which the Chinese-led Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is enabling China to obtain those advantages in data and amplify whatever other threats RCEP poses to the West.
Well, thanks, Congressman. I appreciate your comments about the testimony. I'll also happily defer on a lot of the RCEP details to my colleagues, with USTR experience who are deeper on this. I would just say briefly, I think that what RCEP does with respect to allowing China to continue to carry out this aggressive and mercantilist and predatory data strategy is mostly failing to check any of that in the Chinese system, which is to say that the rules in RCEP that relate to data, cross-border data flows, data localization are soft, They're in some cases, I think, kind of unenforceable because they're not subject to the enforcement mechanisms that do exist in that agreement. What makes it low standard is that it basically allows governments to do as they please. And in the case of Beijing, doing as they please is the construction of this intensely controlled posture where, frankly, Beijing is succeeding at hoarding all of its own data and seeking to absorb all the rest of the world's data through means either legal or illegal. And I think that's the challenge that it poses to us in recognition that we have national security concerns with the exposure of our data, and we all have intense competitive concerns with the control of data over time as an input into innovation and technology.
Yeah, Ms. Bliss, could you also offer your thoughts on that, and particularly what threats RCEP poses and what changes to the digital trade landscape in the Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific region going forward?
Yes. Well, I would largely agree with Mr. Feith's comments with respect to the weaknesses and the dangers of RCEP. And as I previously said, I think overall the flexibilities that are built into the agreement in terms of allowing a country, a member like China, to do as it pleases and impose its own policies is a real danger and risk to us. As Mr. Feith mentioned, the data localization and cross-border flow provisions are incredibly weak and ineffective. And the fact that you have these kinds of standards in the ASEAN region with the significant GDP that it represents is extremely problematic.
Reclaiming my time in the final time, obviously the Trump administration pulled out of TPP. The Biden administration is signaling a lack of interest in CPTPP. How do we prevent China from being part of that?
Well, I don't know if you're addressing it to all of us. I can start maybe just by saying, I think China will have real hurdles. And it is of great concern that they have applied to join CPTPP. The good thing, however, is that the existing CPTPP partners have to agree and on the application, and on China would have to agree to the conditions that were put on the terms of its accession and the negotiation they would have to go through. So working with our allies, I think they would share our concerns, and I think there would be real questions as to whether China could actually meet the standards necessary to join CPTPP. But it's not a given, so it's an ongoing concern. But I do think the fact that that mechanism is in place where you do have to get agreement in order to accede and go through negotiation is at least a safeguard that's in place.
If I can just add, though, I think we need to take this, and this was in my testimony, very seriously, and just relying on our allies and partners to kind of block even the establishment of a working party to start those negotiations for China CPTPP accession. We can't count on them. We're not in that agreement. We can't block it. And even our allies and partners, guess who their largest trading partner is? It's China. Where are their supply chains? Where are they strengthening their supply chains and increasing their economic integration? And so while it's important behind the scenes, we work with our allies and partners, there's nothing better than we can do than by getting back in the region economically, sharing our affirmative agenda and getting others to sign on and really lead the economic future of the Indo-Pacific.
I agree with you, Ms. Cutler. My time has expired and I yield back.
Let me now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. Ms. Cutler, was the whole issue of digital services and digital governance addressed in the TPP?
Clearly, parts of it were, but frankly, that chapter is pretty outdated now. I mean, it was negotiated probably 10 years ago now, put into force 3 years ago. And so, you know, it would need significant updating.
Engagement for both Trump and Biden is not good, no.
We can't do anything.
Hello?
Mr. Barr, you have to mute yourself.
I would ask that my time be paused, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I think I answered your question, so I'm going to.
So, but I guess I want to get at when the United States walked away from its own treaty that it had written, it had negotiated, the TPP, when Donald Trump decided to walk away from that. Did that create a vacuum in terms of economic relationships in the broader trans-Asia Pacific region?
Well, absolutely created a vacuum. And, you know, our trading partners, they got their act together to go forward with the CPTPP without us. Now, lucky for us, they kept most of the provisions intact. But as they go forward and China becomes, you know, increasingly interested in a lot of these arrangements, their ability and their interest in just pursuing what we want them to pursue, you know, is something we just cannot count on.
And it also created a vacuum, did it not, that China is actively filling?
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that the irony of all ironies is China applying to join the CPTPP.
Yeah.
Whoever thought up, you know, that you know, wasn't in the cards.
And I mean, to me, this was one of the most self-inflicted wounds any great power could ever administer to itself. So here we have something like 40% of the world's GDP agreeing to enter into this regime that promoted liberal economic trade and investment and intellectual property protection, human rights, environmental standards, labor standards for the first time under the American protective shadow. And we walk away from our own treaty. And that leaves those countries that were willing to partner with the United States sort of at the mercy now of outrageous fortune and the Chinese. What is a country like, for example, Vietnam to do absent the protective umbrella TPP would have provided? And are you seeing, as a consequence of that, subsequently, countries either in tandem or individually cutting their own deals with China as best they can?
Well, I think RCEP is the testament to that. As long as the TPP negotiations were going on, frankly, there was a lack of interest in the RCEP negotiations. But the fact that 15 Asian countries came together, including 7 CPTPP members, and concluded RCEP that was brought into force earlier this month without us, is really a testament to not only the vacuum we created, but their intent and their confidence to go forward without us.
You know, there were a lot of criticisms, especially, frankly, in my coalition, right, the Democratic coalition, about TPP and that it didn't meet the standards that we wanted. Does the Chinese agreement have human rights standards as part of the agreement?
I mean, RCEP is really just, the chapters are a subset of CPTPP. Did not include human rights, does not include state-owned enterprises, does not include labor, does not include environment, and the list goes on.
So while there were people who found TPP not entirely adequate or not everything they wanted, what has replaced it has zero of that.
RCEP does, but let's keep in mind there is,
No, I'm only talking about RCEP right now.
Yes, correct.
And I just think that's the threat, that, okay, making perfect be the enemy of the good, has now hugely enhanced China's influence in the very region we were trying to counter it, and diminished our own because we walked away from our own agreement. And oh, by the way, ironically, the standards you thought were inadequate are non-existent under the Chinese umbrella.
And RCEP also is not a static agreement. It provides committees, it has a work program, and new rules will probably be discussed among the 15 countries going forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Let me now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Kim, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Bera, and thank you, Ranking Member Shabbat. And I want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us today, and especially Ms. Wendy Cutler. It's really good to see you. Leveraging U.S. engagement in the Indo-Pacific on digital economic opportunities is crucial towards securing U.S. national interests in the region and opening new doors for American commerce. So in my time in Congress so far, I have strongly urged the Biden administration many times to pursue trade agreements that would implement new rules on cross-border data flows, restrictions on data localization and protection of source code. Ensuring the secure movement of data across borders with countries that maintain similarly strong standards is critical towards promoting future-oriented trade that will bolster global commerce and boost technological innovation. As the world continues to evolve in the digital age, it is imperative that our policies and partnerships evolve with it, and that the U.S. is at the aim of countering the techno-authoritarianism and democratizing digital technologies. For these reasons, I led a letter with our fellow members of Congress to the Biden administration last November, urging the president to re-engage the Indo-Pacific on digital trade through new or updated bilateral and plurilateral trade agreements. However, I have yet to see a response to my letter from President Biden, and this committee has yet to see any substantive action in the Pacific on pursuing new digital trade opportunities. So let me ask my first question to you, Mr. Feith. I'd like to focus my questioning first on China's digital Silk Road. Can you provide insight into the present challenges this poses to U.S. national security and economic interests in the Indo-Pacific, and what are potential responses Congress and the administration can take to counter these challenges?
Sure, thank you for that. Well, so the digital Silk Road of China is essentially the digital component of the broader Belt and Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road strategy, as the Chinese still say it in Chinese. And essentially there has been, I think, a lot of attention, justified attention on Chinese built infrastructure projects like ports that have themselves allowed Chinese military access or caused debt problems for the countries that received them. But actually the digital Silk Road, which is to say the digital telecommunications infrastructure that is largely invisible, harder to take a picture of than a port, is probably the more pernicious threat, I think, as your question suggests. And perhaps, in brief, I think the threats are of two main types. One is simply to the data integrity, which is to say that when Chinese companies that are instruments of the state and are subject to coercion by the Chinese state are building undersea cables or mobile telephone infrastructure, infrastructure for commerce and government business in these third countries. All of that is subject to compromise by the Chinese state, by the Chinese security services, and that's a very big problem for the data integrity. And there's the related problem of the political influence that comes with it. These Chinese overseas infrastructure projects seem very often designed to basically insinuate the Chinese Communist Party into the local politics of these countries as a way of exerting some very effective long-arm influence. And sometimes that's through collecting information.
Thank you, Mr. Feith. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your answer. In the interest of time, I'd like to ask Ms. Cutler a couple of questions. Actually, I'll just throw that all in there. What existing or potential future agreements offer the best frameworks for pursuing digital trade opportunities with the Indo-Pacific region, and what strategy do you realistically believe this administration will pursue, and which countries will they primarily seek to partner with? And then if you can further provide the insight on opportunities that remain out there for partnership with ASEAN member nations.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman Kim, and it's great to see you. Just in short, the administration is soon to unveil its Indo-Pacific Economic Framework with details in all of the areas that they have listed, including digital standards and digital technologies. So I'm expecting that we're all going to see a lot more very soon, which will include some kind of initiative on digital with our partners in the region. Now, when we talk about which partners, there are kind of the usual suspects: Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Korea, Singapore. But from my perspective, for any digital initiative, or even for the overall framework to be effective, it needs to go broader than that, particularly with respect to including countries from Southeast Asia. And if that means there needs to be certain flexibilities to allow certain countries to sign on to certain obligations from the get-go, and then over time to phase in others, I think that's, a worthwhile approach. So I think we will be seeing more about digital very soon. I know both USTR and Commerce are working very hard to kind of build out that agenda, and there is a recognition that this is an important part of the overall framework.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing us to go over time, Chairman. I hear back. Thank you, Ms. Wendy Cutler.
Let me recognize the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Manning, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Bera and Ranking Member Shabbat, for organizing this very important hearing. Thank you to our witnesses for sharing your expertise with us today. I'd like to echo Representative Spanberger's concerns about the lack of envoys who have been confirmed throughout the region and frankly throughout the world, and how that is hampering our efforts and our ability to achieve trade agreements and other important agreements in this region and around the world. And many of those envoys and ambassadors are waiting confirmation in the Senate, and I think it's causing real harm to this country. I'd like to also pick up on the issue that Representative Connolly raised, and that is the serious error that the Trump administration made in walking away from the TPP, an agreement that we forged to create a significant regional alliance that would have been hugely beneficial to the U.S. in terms of trade and influence on the standards and behaviors in the region. And right now, as we're talking about all these agreements that we have seen created between other countries in the region, we are basically being left out, and we are being forced to play catch up. So Ms. Cutler, you mentioned a little bit what you would hope to see as the Biden administration releases its Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about what you'd like to see to reinforce our efforts to create a regional bloc that's more aligned with our values and priorities.
Yes, I mean, what I would like to see are just details in all of these areas which show that this initiative overall is serious, that we're committed to the long term to economic ties with the region, and that it goes beyond just principles and best practices. It actually has rules, norms, and standards that we will be asking others to join us in embracing, and has some real tangible outcomes that really matter and are impactful. So whether it be in digital or in infrastructure or in clean technologies or supply chains, there's a lot to be done in all of these areas. And frankly, we need to move quickly.
Thank you. Ms. Bliss, since President Trump withdrew from the TPP in 2017, and in the absence of any substitute engagement, can you talk to us about what the impact has been on U.S. companies in the region? In particular, what kinds of discriminatory trade barriers have we watched in the digital realm in the past few years?
Thank you, Congresswoman. What we've seen in particular is a continued rise in digital protectionism. And as I mentioned previously, particularly in the area of data localization requirements, and on restrictions on cross-border data flows. I can mention specifically, I mentioned Korea and Indonesia in particular as examples of where data localization measures are still significant problems for US companies across the services sector. And so that, I believe, in part, is a direct result of the US not participating and being able to be part of the TPP and now CPTPP. But I will say, as previous witnesses have said, I would totally agree that, we've gone beyond CPTPP in what we included on digital trade in USMCA, the US-Japan agreement. But more importantly, I think what some of our trading partners are doing, Australia, Singapore, and the UK in particular. And there are some really strong, innovative provisions that I think can be helpful in combating the rise of digital protectionism. So I think we need to look at those.
Thank you. Mr. Feith, we've seen how China exerts pressure against American companies like Apple, forcing them to store consumer data on Chinese servers or censor applications in return for market access. What can the U.S. do in our trade engagements to push back on these efforts across the region?
Frankly, it's a very difficult one in the sense that there are certainly some companies, and Apple is a real example, that have made themselves very strongly dependent on what they can get only in China. In Apple's case, in terms of the manufacturing supply chain, and therefore they're in a position where they comply with even the very onerous and predatory and fundamentally unfair and non-reciprocal laws and regulations that China imposes. I think that the ability to fix that, frankly, from Washington is limited, which I think is why the problem persists to such an unfortunate degree. I think that in the long term, though, this digital and data trade discussion might need to point frankly, into a kind of a world that I feel like we can't even really imagine at the moment, where essentially we have arrangements where countries that want to follow essentially, democratic and liberal norms of data trade align ourselves into, something of a data trade zone and a block, and actually consider over time not only privileging each other, but actually imposing restrictions and tariffs on the likes of China and others who will continue to not follow these rules of reciprocal and open trade.
Thank you. My time has expired and I yield back.
Thank you. I want to thank our members for their questions and to the witnesses for their responses. With member questions not concluded, I'll move to my closing remarks and then recognize the ranking member for any closing remarks that you may have. I think, for folks that are watching this, as well as for our witnesses and members of the administration, you've seen bipartisan support for engagement and, a desire from the members of this subcommittee, but I believe in a bipartisan, bicameral way, a desire for the United States to engage with the region in a way that, doesn't disadvantage our workers, addresses environmental concerns, but also sets standards and norms for digital trade and beyond in the region. I think recent history also suggests, with USMCA, that with an inclusive process that does take time, does take a lot of effort, you can come up with a strong bipartisan agreement that it can be supported by labor, environmental groups, the business community, and others. And has a strong standard. So I welcome the ability to work with the various groups, but also with the administration as they engage and start to lay out their economic framework for engagement with the Indo-Pacific, and I look forward to working with the ranking member, Mr. Shabbat, and other members of this subcommittee as this process goes forward. And with that, let me go ahead and recognize the ranking member, Mr. Shabbat, for any closing comments that he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me commend you for holding a really excellent hearing, I believe, on a very important issue. As I said in my opening statement, countries throughout the Indo-Pacific are hungry for U.S. economic engagement. And I agree with you that the digital trade is a good place to start. Such an agreement would bring many benefits to the U.S. economy. And as the past chairman of the House Small Business Committee, I particularly appreciate Ms. Bliss mentioning the importance of a digital agreement for small and medium-sized enterprises. The stakes are high if we sit on the sidelines. As our witnesses have said, the PRC is seeking to export digital standards to the rest of the world that are radically different from those that we would create. Unfortunately, this administration's rather nebulous statements about an economic framework for the region really don't inspire a great deal of confidence that their strategy is up to the task. So I appreciate your leadership on this issue and look forward to working with you and our colleagues over on the Ways and Means Committee to make some progress on this critical area. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. And I want to once again thank our witnesses and the members who participated in this very important virtual hearing. And with that, the hearing is adjourned. Virtual gavel banging.